For more than a decade, one man and a handful of companions slipped through mountains and desert as entire armies and new laws reshaped the Southwest around them. Geronimo became the figure the United States and Mexico could not ignore, not because he led huge forces, but because his resistance exposed a clash of worlds: land, survival, and sovereignty. Welcome. If you appreciate close, careful history told with attention and respect, please consider subscribing. This is the story of Geronimo and the Apache Wars, the last sustained resistance of the Southwest against the sweep of settler expansion, army campaigns, and shifting borders. It is a story of terrain as much as of people: the jagged ridges of the Sierra Madre, the scrub and canyons of what we now call Arizona and New Mexico, the borderlands where cultures met and often collided. Those landscapes were not empty. They shaped strategy, survival, and identity. We will meet the man whose Apache name was Goyali, often called Geronimo by others, and through his life we will trace the larger currents that pushed Apache communities into conflict: treaties that were poorly understood or broken, the arrival of railroads and settlers, and the creation of reservations, pieces of land set aside by the government for native peoples, often far from ancestral homes. We will explain terms plainly. A reservation is simply land reserved for a people. A raid was a quick strike meant to take resources or respond to threats. Surrender in this context meant the formal giving up of arms under orders from opposing governments. Across the next 45 minutes we will listen to voices too often drowned by legend: Apache oral accounts, soldier journals, civilian letters, and newspaper reports. We will separate myth from memory, how Geronimo came to symbolize defiance in some minds and criminality in others, and we will show how the Apache Wars were not a single event but a long series of encounters, negotiations, setbacks, and resilience. You will see tactics born of intimate knowledge of landscape, the wearying diplomacy of leaders trying to protect families, and the human costs of policies born in distant capitals. By the end, this won't be a simple hero tale or a one-dimensional chronicle of conquest. It will be a careful look at a people's last sustained resistance in the Southwest, and at the man who became its most famous face. Stay with us to understand how those years continue to shape the region today. Hook plus brief greeting plus soft subscribe. During the 19th century, the vast deserts and jagged mountain ranges of the Southwest became the theater for one of the last great resistances to American expansion, and at its center stood a single name that would echo far beyond the canyons: Geronimo. Hello. If you find this kind of deep, careful history useful, please consider subscribing for more stories told in a calm, cinematic way. The Apache people were not a single tribe but a collection of related groups who lived across what is now the borderlands of the United States and Mexico. They moved with the seasons, followed game, and lived in small family bands that could disperse or gather as needed. That mobility was not only a way of life, it was a strategy for survival, and it became a central strength when confronting new pressures from settlers and the armies that followed them. The word reservation describes land set aside by governments for indigenous peoples, often far smaller and less fertile than traditional territories, and the creation of those places fundamentally altered how the Apache could feed, move, and govern themselves. Goyali, the man known to the world as Geronimo, belonged to the Badonko band of the Apache. His personal history is key to understanding why he fought so persistently. He grew up in a world already under pressure, where raids, reprisals, and shifting alliances had become part of daily reality. Loss and displacement shape him, and those private losses were echoed in the wider dismantling of Apache autonomy. He was not a sole commander with a large standing force. Rather, he led small, highly mobile bands, often no more than a few dozen people, who used intimate knowledge of terrain and weather to slip through cavalry lines and evade encirclement. Tactics mattered. Apache fighters used speed and surprise, knowledge of boulder-strewn ravines, and the hiding places of the high desert to their advantage. They combined traditional weapons with firearms when available, and they moved like the land itself, unpredictable, quiet, and difficult to pin down. The United States Army, meanwhile, learned that standard linear tactics and large columns could be ineffective in such country. Commanders experimented with scouts from within Apache communities, fort networks, and small, mobile detachments. The result was a war of tracking and counter-tracking across an international border. Mexico and the United States each had to adjust to the reality that Apache bands did not respect imposed borders when survival was at stake. Negotiation and betrayal are recurring themes in this story. Commanders such as General George Crook attempted to combine military pressure with diplomacy, offering terms to Apache leaders in hopes of securing surrenders without endless pursuit. Those negotiations sometimes appeared to work, and at other times they unraveled as promises were disputed or seen as untrustworthy. When a promise of relocation or safe passage was perceived as broken, it could send men like Geronimo back into the mountains. That cycle, parleys followed by flight, kept the conflict alive for years and fed mutual distrust. Cross-border politics complicated matters further. When Apache bands moved south into the Sierra Madre, Mexican forces pursued them as well, and these incursions created diplomatic friction with the United States. At times American soldiers followed across the border in pursuit, which required delicate arrangements with Mexican authorities. The Apache, for their part, treated the border as a practical line on a map rather than a barrier to survival. Their raids and retreats could move from one side to the other in a single night. The shifting jurisdiction meant that Apache leaders could exploit international complexity, but it also exposed non-combatants to reprisals and left civilians on both sides caught between policies and patrols. Capture did not always end resistance. Geronimo evaded capture repeatedly and surrendered more than once, each time weighing the immediate safety of his people against the longer-term dangers of confinement on a reservation. One decisive moment came when a small detachment led by an army officer, working with Apache scouts who had turned allegiance, persuaded him to lay down arms. That surrender marked a turning point. He and the remaining members of his band were taken into custody and held as prisoners of war. The term prisoner of war in this case meant confinement away from their homeland, under military authority, and with limited freedom. For Geronimo, who had spent a lifetime moving across rugged country, this confinement was a profound reversal. Life after capture was complex and often humiliating. Instead of returning to their lands, Geronimo and many of his people were transported far from the southwest and held at military posts. They became part of a larger policy that sought to neutralize armed resistance by removing leaders and dispersing bands. Yet even in confinement, Geronimo remained a figure of fascination. Photographs were taken, he spoke with visitors, newspapers printed stories about him. He became, unwillingly, part of the national imagination, a symbol turned in many directions, of savage resistance by some, of tragic survival by others, and of a vanishing way of life by still others. The end of large-scale Apache armed resistance did not make the underlying tensions vanish. Policies that created reservations, the pressures of settlers claiming land, and the imposition of foreign legal and economic systems continued to reshape indigenous life. Some Apache adapted by finding new economic roles, others tried to preserve language and custom, and communities endured the loss of seasonal rounds and sacred places. Yet the story also contains resilience. Families kept traditions alive through stories, songs, and the careful transmission of knowledge about plants, weather, and landscape. There are personal moments that reveal more than broad strategy ever can. An elderly woman who had followed a band for decades remembered the quiet of dawn in a canyon when the light first touched the rocks. A scout who had taken money to work with the army later wrote about the moral uncertainty of tracking men who had once been allies. Small acts, sharing a blanket, teaching a child to read a river, mattered in the daily lives of people caught between worldviews. These intimate details help explain why some chose to fight and why others chose to yield when the mountain offered no safe path. Cultural misunderstandings played a huge role. A treaty interpreted differently by two sides could cause a clash. A ceremony cut short by a patrol could be read as a threat. Terms like surrender and parole had technical meanings in military law but different moral weight in Apache practice. Explaining such terms simply, surrender meant handing over arms and accepting the authority of those who captured you. Parole meant giving your word, sometimes under pressure, to follow certain rules. In communities where reputation, reciprocity, and kin obligation mattered deeply, those legal terms did not always carry the same authority. Beyond the tactical and the legal, the story of Geronimo and the Apache Wars speaks to the human costs of empire and resistance. It asks how families protect themselves when game shifts and governments change. It asks what it means for a people to guard a landscape that others see as empty or open for settlement. And it asks how names, Geronimo's among them, are shaped by headlines, photographs, and the slow work of history. The legacy of that resistance remains visible in place names, in oral histories told by descendants, and in the museums and archives that house correspondence, scouting reports, and first-person accounts. Those records show both the limits of military power in rough country and the limits of policy that fails to account for human attachments to land. They teach that endings are rarely clean. Surrender can mark both a military conclusion and the start of a long struggle to preserve community amid enforced change. In the quiet after the last major campaigns, the Southwest itself kept speaking through weather, water, and stone. The landscape had shaped tactics, and tactics had transformed lives. Geronimo's story is part of that transformation, a closing chapter of one era and the first lines of another. If this account brought new clarity, and you would like more stories that blend careful fact with a cinematic tone, please subscribe gently and stay with us for further explorations. Thank you for listening. The Southwest Frontier and Apache Homelands. During the 19th century, the vast lands of the American Southwest unfolded like a patchwork of extremes, where high pine forests gave way to arid basins and sudden, knife-edged ranges rose from desert floors. The region was not an empty wilderness. It held complex, lived-in landscapes, a network of waterholes, seasonal trails, and stone shelters known intimately by the peoples who made their homes there. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this unfolding story compelling, please subscribe for more. Apache homelands lay across that whole mosaic, stretching across what are now state and national borders, and into valleys and mountains on both sides of the line. The name Apache covers a number of cultural groups and bands, each with its own patterns of movement and use of the land. Some groups were tied to high, cool woodlands where pinon and juniper offered nuts and tinder. Others lived in the thorny depths of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, where agave and mesquite were food and craft material. The Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Western Apache, these labels help historians and listeners understand broad cultural patterns, but many families identified first with local places, a certain canyon, a spring, a ridge where deer gathered in winter. Water was the organizing fact of life. Small cienagas, marshy wetlands fed by springs, and cienagas' cousin features, seasonal streams called arroyos, determined where people traveled and camped. A spring could mean survival for a whole band during a dry spell. Rivers such as the Gila and the Rio Grande traced corridors of plants and birds, and they offered predictable places for gathering wild grasses and for following game. The Apache economy was flexible. Bands moved with the seasons, hunting where game and edible plants were abundant, and harvesting agave and cactus fruits at their peaks. When horses became central to life, mobility increased. Long-distance journeys that once would have been arduous were suddenly within reach. The horse did not just change speed. It changed strategy, trade, and the shape of kin networks. The idea of a frontier in this region was not a clear line on a map. It was a shifting zone of encounter and contest, an area where different lifeways met. On one side were settlers, miners, and military outposts that brought fences, livestock, and new markets. On the other were indigenous families and bands whose livelihoods depended on flexible movement, shared access to grazing and water, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape. The frontier was a place of exchange as well as conflict. Trade routes threaded the region. Commodity flows of horses, wool, woven goods, and store-bought metal tools connected Apache bands with Hispanic ranchers and traders, especially in borderlands near Sonora and Chihuahua. At the same time, informal economies emerged around raiding and prize-taking, which were complex practices bound up in local norms, survival strategies, and retaliation cycles. Topography shaped tactics. Deep canyons and labyrinthine rock formations provided natural strongholds. High ridgelines gave lookouts a vantage for spotting parties from far off, and washes choked with brush allowed for rapid concealment. The Chiricahua Mountains and the Pinalino Range, for example, offered refuge and gardens of edible plants. The Sierra Madre on the Mexican side provided cross-border sanctuaries. In winter months, families might favor sheltered valleys with available firewood and water, while in the heat of summer they moved to higher elevations to escape the desert sun. This seasonal ebb and flow was not aimless. It followed a calendared logic rooted in generations of observation. When mesquite beans ripened, when pinon nuts could be harvested, when migratory birds arrived. European and later Anglo-American incursions altered those rhythms. Spanish colonists and then Mexican settlers established missions and presidios, simple garrisons, and introduced ranching systems that fenced land and enclosed water. The mission near Tucson, known as San Xavier del Bac, stands as an example of a permanent colonial presence introduced into a landscape of mobility. Those missions were places of religious teaching, labor demands, and settlement, and they reshaped local economies by introducing new crops, animals, and social pressures. Ranchos drained grasslands with grazing cattle, while silver mines and their supply lines created corridors that cut through traditional routes. Roads and later stagecoach lines made certain valleys into arteries of colonial presence. Over time, the frontier acquired a denser human footprint. The places where people pitched camp became fewer, and competition over resources intensified. Language and social organization were part of land use. Apache kin networks were organized into bands centered on related families. Leaders emerged based on skill, knowledge, and consensus rather than imposed authority. Bands would cooperate in hunting or defense and disperse when resources demanded. Clans and kin ties allowed people to share information about water and food sources over great distances, sometimes crossing into Mexican territories where trading partners or kin lived. The capacity to weave alliances, both within Apache groups and with neighboring Pueblo, Mexican, or Hispanic communities, was crucial. It did not mean harmony at all times. Rather, it meant a complex diplomacy in which reciprocal trade, hospitality, and sometimes marriage linked people across imagined boundaries. The environment itself was a teacher. People learned how to read weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of insects. They recognized the signs of an approaching monsoon, a smell in the dry washes, a certain wind direction. That knowledge informed where a band would set up camp for a week or a season. Local botanical expertise also mattered. Agave requires long preparation to make edible hearts. Its fibers made rope. Its fermented juices offered a drink. Mesquite beans were ground into flour. Cacti provided water and food in harsh months. Such uses required a deep, practical understanding passed down in stories and apprenticeship, not in written manuals. Cross-border movement complicates simple maps. Apache territories, like human territories everywhere, paid little heed to later political lines drawn by distant governments. Mountain passes and valleys carried people, ideas, and goods across what would become an international boundary. When conflict increased, those same cross-border options allowed bands to seek refuge in Mexican highlands or to draw on trade networks that stretched southward. At the local level, a family might have relations on both sides of the border. A spring in one valley might be maintained by one kin group while another used a different slope the next season. This fluidity made any single colonial policy difficult to enforce. Military and civilian infrastructures left scars on the land, but they also created new landscapes of memory. Forts built to secure roads and mining interests cut clearings and established trails. These features changed where game moved and where water could be accessed. Over time, some springs were diverted for settlements. Others dried out under new patterns of grazing. The cumulative impact of ranching, mining, and settlement gradually altered the ecological balance, influencing how people could sustain traditional foodways. This was not always immediate. It played out over decades as forests were thinned and grasslands were overgrazed. Material culture reflected adaptation and continuity. Families used woven baskets for collecting seeds. Bone awls and wooden digging sticks appeared alongside metal knives and rifles obtained through trade or capture. Blankets and clothing often mixed traditional and introduced materials. The horse was a case in point. Once rare, it became central to hunting and warfare, but also to prestige and economy. Saddles and bridles of local workmanship blended with imported saddlery styles. Houses, too, were adapted to climate. Wickiups, portable shelters made from brush and hides, remained practical for nomadic life, while those who wintered in certain locales sometimes built more permanent shelters. The human stories bound to this landscape included moments of resilience and adjustment as well as friction and loss. Families negotiated daily life amid newcomers, adapting hunting patterns, opening new trade routes, or retreating to remote valleys. Children learned how to survive on the move. Elders taught the roots of birds and where certain medicinal plants were found. Markets near presidios offered a mix of manufactured goods and local craft, enabling some Apache artisans to earn trade silver or cloth while maintaining cultural practices. Finally, when we look to the southwest frontier as a concept, we must remember that it was experienced differently by each participant. For settlers, it might have been a place of opportunity or peril. For Apache families, it was homeland, a living place with ancestry and lore embedded in rock and water. The borders drawn on maps could never fully capture the layered accuracy of a spring's depth, the memory of a hunting trail, or the value of a particular oak grove where elders gathered. The land itself continued to shape lives, long after policies and armies had tried to redraw it. Why conflict escalated? Borders, raids, retaliation. When the line on the map hardened into checkpoints and patrols, daily life in the Southwest changed in ways that made violence more likely. Hello, thank you for listening, and if you like this account, please consider subscribing for more stories told this way. Borders in that era were not just ink. They were competing claims to water, grazing land, and the very routes people relied upon to move through a harsh landscape. For Apache bands like the Chiricahua and, more specifically, the Badonko band that counted Geronimo among its leaders, the border was an artificial interruption of traditional territories that had long cut across what later became two nations. A raid, in simple terms, meant a fast, targeted incursion to seize goods, horses, or people, and it was a familiar tactic across many peoples and places. For the Apache, raids served many purposes: replenishing depleted supplies, asserting independence, retaliating for earlier losses, and maintaining a form of economic and social exchange that had existed long before settlers arrived. Horses were central. They were mobility and power. Losing horses meant losing freedom of movement and the ability to hunt or escape. Stealing horses from a ranching camp or a military detachment could restore a band's capacity to live on their own terms. Those same raids, however, struck settler communities and travelers as criminal and terrifying, prompting them to organize posses, lobby for military intervention, and seek revenge. The imposition of reservations altered incentives in a devastating way. A reservation is simply land set aside by a government for a particular people, often governed by agency officials rather than the inhabitants themselves. When large groups of Apache were moved onto designated reservations, they faced crowded conditions, limited access to traditional food sources, and officials who often misunderstood local customs. Leadership choices shaped escalation as well. Some Apache leaders sought negotiated settlements and tried to work within the constraints imposed upon their people, believing that accommodation might preserve life and some autonomy. Others, including Geronimo at various points, chose flight and resistance, interpreting past betrayals and the harsh realities of reservation life as reasons to keep fighting. That divergence among leaders produced internal tensions and unpredictable patterns of violence and retreat. When a charismatic leader led a return to raiding, opposing forces tended to respond with overwhelming force intended to remove the leader entirely. That in turn fueled the leader's renown and solidified the resolve of followers who feared captivity or starvation more than continued conflict. Economic pressures hardened positions on both sides. Settlers wanted safe passage for trade, access to grazing for cattle, and protection of property. Governments wanted to establish order and open land for development. Apache communities sought to maintain livelihoods that depended on mobility and seasonal access to resources. When cattle replaced wild game, when fences appeared across migratory routes, and when wells were privatized, the options for peaceful coexistence narrowed. Every stolen animal and every punitive raid was entangled with these larger shifts. The result was a feedback loop. Raids provoked reprisals, reprisals destroyed resources, and resource scarcity prompted further raids. Legal and military strategies eventually shifted toward containment and elimination of mobility as a military goal. Army tactics emphasized cutting off supplies, destroying food caches, and taking family members as leverage to force compliance. Such methods broke down some resistance by targeting the social fabric of mobile bands rather than individual fighters. Those measures were effective at short-term suppression, but they also hardened anger and left lingering resentments that would shape relations for generations. Efforts at cross-border cooperation improved only unevenly. Sometimes Mexican and American forces coordinated pursuit, and other times diplomatic hesitation or local hostilities prevented effective joint action. Meanwhile, Apache parties continued to exploit gaps between jurisdictions when they could. Personal narratives illustrate the escalation plainly. A small raid to reclaim horses could trigger a malicious sweeping response. That response might capture the young men and force families onto reservations. Escaped men would strike back to recover what had been taken or to punish those they held responsible. The boundaries of justice blurred into cycles of revenge. Communities on both sides learned the language of suspicion. Men returned from scouts to news of a neighbor's disappearance, and commanders returned to reports of a burned corral. Trust eroded. Each new incident was not isolated. It was read against a long ledger of grievances. By the time large-scale military campaigns took the field, the pattern was entrenched. Patrols hunted bands across a landscape that had become militarized. Apache mobility, once an advantage, had been corralled by strategic pressure, imprisonment, and the shrinking of options. Some groups surrendered and adapted, others were exiled, and some persisted in small-scale resistance. The escalation born of borders, raids, and retaliation had transformed everyday survival strategies into a prolonged, destructive contest. The border had been intended to create order, but instead it became the seam along which contested sovereignties ripped the region apart. There is a quietness to the end of such cycles that belies the long road that brought it. The repeated pattern, raid, reprisal, seizure, flight, left scars on landscapes and memories alike. Those scars shaped laws, policies, and communities for decades after the last wide-ranging campaigns ended. The story of why conflict escalated in the Southwest is therefore not a single cause but a confluence. Rigid borders that ignored traditional patterns of movement, raids that were both survival strategy and political statement, and retaliation that multiplied grievances instead of resolving them. All three fed one another until the region could no longer return to the balance it once knew. Thank you for staying with this account. If this deep dive into the dynamics of border conflict and resistance resonated with you, please subscribe for more explorations told in the same careful, cinematic way. Geronimo's world and leadership. During the 19th century, the ragged spine of the Sierra Madre and the broom-strewn mesas of the American Southwest framed a life that would become both legend and living resistance. Hello. If you find this telling worth your time, please subscribe for more stories like this. Geronimo was born into a Badonko band of the Apache and known by his birth name, Goyali, which is often translated as one who yawns. That name, quiet and human, stood in contrast to the storms that would shape his years: raids across borders, the steady advance of settlements, and the steady pressure of policies that aimed to confine people to reservations, land set aside by the government for native nations. These were places meant to reduce mobility and autonomy. For a people who had long read the weather and the trail as maps of survival, the reservation system was a profound disruption. The world that Geronimo knew was defined by kinship and small band life rather than by large, centralized chiefs. Apache society organized itself around extended families and flexible groupings that could split and rejoin as seasons and needs demanded. Mobility was a strategic asset. Horses, which the Apache had embraced by the end of the 18th century, transformed hunting and raiding, and with them the tactics of resistance. Geronimo's leadership emerged from this context. It was practical, adaptive, and deeply personal. He did not inherit a throne. He earned authority through acts, through guiding people across difficult country, through success in the field, and through spiritual practices that gave people confidence in him. Leadership among the Apache often rested on persuasion and reputation. A leader had to convince others to follow, and Geronimo had that capacity in abundance. His approach to conflict relied on speed, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the capacity to melt away into the landscape. Small war parties moved fast. They took care to avoid large, open battles and instead struck where larger military units were weakest, on supply lines, at isolated outposts, or by reclaiming resources such as stolen horses. The term guerrilla, which simply means irregular tactics used by small groups, fits much of what Geronimo practiced. These tactics were effective because they turned conventional military strengths, numbers, fixed supply chains, and formal formations, into liabilities in an environment where knowledge of trails, water, and the weather were everything. Survival depended on knowing which canyon would hold shade at noon, which arroyo would hide a camp, and which ridge offered an unobstructed view for miles. Geronimo's character was forged in grief and hardened in exile. He carried the memory of a violent raid in which his wife, his mother, and his children were killed in an attack by soldiers in northern Mexico. That loss pushed him into a life of resistance, but it also illuminated the mixture of motives that drove him: defense of family and land, anger at injustices, and a refusal to accept confinement under terms he and his people did not choose. He moved fluidly between war leader and spiritual figure. Spirituality and ritual in Apache life are not separated from politics or strategy. They inform decisions, calm the anxious, and bind a group together. Geronimo's public persona blended the authority of a healer and medium with the acumen of a commander who could inspire loyalty in men and women willing to face almost impossible odds. Negotiation and practicality sat alongside resistance in his leadership. There were moments when Geronimo engaged in talks, accepted truces, or surrendered temporarily. Choices often made to protect families, to buy time, or to secure supplies. Yet he repeatedly escaped confinement when conditions became intolerable. After one final series of campaigns, he surrendered to a United States general who had been ordered to bring an end to the long-running conflicts. The surrender ended the organized military resistance in the region, but it did not erase Geronimo's impact. He was transported away from the land he knew, taken first to military prisons in the southeastern United States and later to a military post in what is now Oklahoma. Those moves were meant to neutralize his influence by cutting him off from his home and the networks that sustain it. Even in captivity, Geronimo remained a figure who drew attention. He was photographed and exhibited to curious crowds, and he traveled under supervision to participate in public events that turned him into a kind of reluctant celebrity. He walked a complicated line between being a prisoner and a public symbol. Many in the wider American audience consumed an image of him that was sensationalized, while Apache observers read a far more nuanced man, one who had fought for a life his ancestors had known for generations and who had adapted to impossible new conditions with stubborn ingenuity. His final years were quiet by contrast. but the stories of his escapes, his negotiations, and his uncanny ability to survive in hostile terrain circulated long after he died far from the mountains and canyons of his youth. Geronimo's leadership can be understood as a bundle of interlocking strengths: intimate local knowledge, the moral authority earned through sacrifice, deft small group tactics, and a political flexibility born of survival. He led not as a sole, absolute ruler, but as a central figure who could persuade, protect, and, when necessary, punish. His choices reflected the priorities of a people who valued family, freedom of movement, and the right to determine their own lives. That grounding helps explain why he became the emblematic leader of the last organized resistance in the Southwest. He synthesized Apache values with relentless adaptability in the face of expanding borders and centralized power. To speak plainly about terms, a band was a small kin group that could decide its own movements and actions. A reservation was land assigned by an outside government for indigenous occupancy under strict rules. Those simple definitions matter because they clarify the collision between ways of life. Geronimo navigated that collision by leaning on the old skills: tracking, negotiation, small unit tactics, and by molding them to each new reality imposed upon him. His was leadership fueled by lived expertise. It commanded respect not through ceremony alone, but through practical success and the oath-like loyalty that comes when people believe their leader will keep them alive. Examples of his leadership's effectiveness are scattered across oral histories and contemporary military reports alike. Column commanders would report days of fruitless pursuit as Geronimo and a handful of followers slipped into broken country and evaporated. Local settlers told tales of sudden raids that reclaimed horses or supplies and then vanished. Apache families returned to homeland areas at nightfall, guided by routes known only to insiders. Even when outnumbered and outgunned, these small units endured by refusing the predictable routes where larger forces could trap them. Those anecdotes, told again and again, build a portrait of a leader who used time and space as weapons, and who turned the desert's apparent emptiness into a shield. Leadership also had a theatrical side in Geronimo's life. When he appeared before curious crowds in eastern cities, he performed a version of himself: stoic, inscrutable, unbowed. Photographs from those years show a man who could never simply be reduced to the caricatures others made of him. He answered questions with clipped phrases. He told stories when it suited him. And he remained, to the very end, a touchstone for debates about sovereignty, honor, and the treatment of indigenous peoples. The fact that he never returned to his mountain home despite repeated petitions from friends and relatives underscores a painful truth. Leadership can carry a price, and that price is sometimes the loss of the very place a leader defends. In the final accounting, Geronimo's leadership resists tidy labels. He was warrior, healer, negotiator, and survivor. He moved in the interstices of two worlds, one defined by Apache traditions and the other by an expanding federal and settler society. His methods: quick raids, strategic retreats, occasional surrenders, and public engagement, reflect a leader constantly calibrating between resistance and accommodation. That constant recalibration is itself a form of command, the ability to change tactics without losing the loyalty of those who followed him. It is why, even decades after his last stand, historians and storytellers return to his life as a study in leadership forged by necessity and tempered by place. This story of a man shaped by mountains, by loss, and by the need to keep his people together offers lessons that reach beyond its own time. Leadership can be local and pragmatic, spiritual and strategic at once. It can be shaped as much by landscape and family as by formal titles. And, despite the relentless forces arrayed against him, Geronimo found ways to lead that preserved a measure of dignity and autonomy for himself and for those who trusted him. That persistence, quiet, stubborn, and deeply human, remains the clearest mark of his world and of the leadership he practiced until the end. Campaigns, pursuits, and hard terrain. Hello. If you enjoy this slow, unfolding account, please consider subscribing for more stories told this way. During the 19th century, the borderlands of the Southwest became a crucible where small bands moved like shadows through a landscape that defeated armies. The story of Geronimo and the Apache resistance can be told as a contest between two kinds of mastery: the Apache mastery of place and the Army's mastery of organization. Terrain shaped every choice. Canyons funneled movement. Ridges offered observation. Water points determined the line between survival and retreat. That simple geography forced campaigns into patterns of pursuit, evasion, and attrition. The word guerrilla, which simply means small unit irregular fighting, describes the tactics the Apaches relied on. They were not interested in set-piece battles. Their warfare emphasized speed, surprise, knowledge of the ground, and minimal logistics. A band might be a few dozen people, sometimes fewer, moving by day or night, stopping only where water could be found and where the cover of broken earth hid them from view. 4 soldiers raised in the doctrine of columns and supply trains. This presented a problem that was logistical as well as tactical. A pursuing army needed feed and fodder for horses, fuel for men, and secure lines of communication. The land denied all of these with harsh efficiency. Chiricahua ridges, the deep washes of the Sonoran deserts, and the steep folds of the Sierra Madre made any wide, rolling advance virtually impossible. Mountains rose suddenly from desert flats. Oak and juniper forests clung to slopes where mule paths threaded through talus and narrow benches. In such country, a small group that knew where the springs were and how to move without leaving a clear trail could vanish. One valley might be impossible for a column of soldiers to cross in a single day, while a night-moving party of Apaches could thread 3 different ridgelines, scatter into 3 smaller groups at dawn, and reassemble 2 days later at a known spring. The land allowed improvisation. It punished predictability. Examples of how campaigns unfolded make this plain. Army columns would set out from a fort or garrison and march toward a suspected camp, sometimes guided by scouts who could interpret a half-broken twig as a recent crossing. Men would sweep ridgelines and long arcs, hoping to catch a band between 2 converging forces. At other times, commanders used blockhouses, telegraph stations, or fortified supply depots as anchors, trying to channel movement into predictable corridors. The Apaches responded by avoiding these anchors, preferring lateral movement through lesser-known drainages and by breaking into smaller raiding parties that could slip past a cordon. That interplay, cordon attempts countered by dispersal and misdirection, became the rhythm of operations. Scouts are a term that bears a short explanation. Scouts were individuals, often Native Americans themselves, hired or enlisted to guide troops and to track other indigenous people. Their knowledge could be the difference between capture and escape. Some scouts were Apache who, for complex reasons of survival, alliance, or coercion, worked with the army. Their names appear at times in records as indispensable. They read tracks, located water, and taught soldiers how to move quietly. But scouts could not give an army the advantage the land already gave the Apache bands. An army size became a handicap in rough country. Wagons and animals needed paths. Men in uniform were visible. A large column was easier to spot from a ridge and easier to avoid. Pursuits often turned into long-distance chases that cut across an international border. Bands traveling between what are now parts of the United States and northern Mexico exploited that political seam, crossing that borderline complicated pursuit because jurisdictional concerns and diplomatic friction limited how far a pursuing force could go. Mexican authorities could, and sometimes did, pursue Apache bands independently. At other times they coordinated with American commanders. The result was a patchwork of operations: cavalry detachments sweeping one valley, Mexican horsemen moving up from the south, Apache scouts quietly shadowing the trackers. The landscape magnified that patchwork, since it afforded so many unobserved routes. Weather and seasons played a continuous role. Summers baked the desert and reduced water availability to trickles. Winters could drop snow on higher ridges, pushing small bands to lower elevations or forcing them into more exposed movement. Heat sapped animals and men. Cold made shelter urgent. For armies dependent on extended supply lines, this meant operations were often confined to windows when forage and water could be relied upon. The Apaches, by contrast, timed movement around local microclimates. They cached supplies, knew scarcely visible springs, and could move to an evergreen slope for shade and concealment in summer. The land set the tempo of campaigns. Tactical adaptations on both sides deserve attention. The army introduced innovations: telegraph lines to speed communication, watchtowers to look across passes, and the use of Indian scouts to find tracks. Railroad lines altered supply and movement, bringing resources closer to the edge of theater. Yet technology cannot fill in where a map is wrong and a canyon unmarked. The maps available to many commanders were incomplete. Peaks had local names known only to those who lived there. A creek might be dry for much of the year and thus absent from official charts. Apache guides used mental maps of water and trail that had been built over generations and could point out a patch of tender grass or a seep that the most detailed army map had missed. Small unit engagements tended to favor the smaller party. A military patrol that wandered into a well-laid ambush could be driven back or, less dramatically, forced to withdraw and bide its time. The Apache approach was often to strike quickly and then melt away. After a raid, they would disperse to rendezvous at a remote spring or a cave mouth. To close such gaps, armies tried to seal off escape routes by moving multiple columns from different directions. Coordination could work, but the necessary timing was demanding. Mountain ridges created blind spots, and the practicalities of marching men over rough ground made simultaneous convergence difficult. A misstep in timing could mean that the columns pass miles apart on either side of the very band they sought. The human costs of these pursuits were measured partly in exhaustion and attrition rather than battlefield casualties alone. Soldiers marched until their boots wore through. Horses and mules died quietly where water was scarce. Men fell ill from exposure or the stresses of long marches. The Apache experienced similar strains, especially when on the move for extended periods. Children, elders, and those weakened by earlier losses added to the vulnerability. Because the Apache fought to preserve mobility and family integrity, the campaigns were, in many cases, aimed at breaking that ability to move, occupying springs, destroying caches, and forcing camps into fixed positions on reservations. That strategy shifted the conflict from a contest of arms to a contest of survival and resources. Leadership mattered in the field. Commanders who took the land seriously and listened to experienced scouts had better results than those who relied solely on doctrine. Some officers developed the habit of sending small, fast detachments rather than lumbering forward with a full column. They learned to adapt patrol lengths to the typical distance an Apache band might travel in a day and to anticipate likely rendezvous points. On the other side, leaders such as Geronimo exercised a combination of personal daring and discipline. He could move his group at varied paces, make rapid decisions about when to divide and when to concentrate, and maintain cohesion across long distances. That leadership turned terrain from an obstacle into a partner. Diplomacy and the politics of pursuit should not be neglected. A campaign was also a political act. How far a government would pursue, how it treated captured non-combatants, and how it negotiated with local authorities influenced the choices made in the field. Cross-border operations required negotiation and sometimes led to standoffs when one government's forces pushed the limits of another's tolerance. The presence of foreign troops in a neighboring nation's rugged borderlands could inflame local populations or lead to uneasy cooperation. These political realities shaped the operational envelope commanders felt free to exploit. Individual episodes illustrate the dynamic. A small army detachment might attempt to encircle a known camp by moving along both sides of a canyon. The Apache, seeing the approach from a high vantage, would move through a secondary drainage, using a maze of boulder-strewn washes no larger force could follow without breaking its formation. The detachment would find an emptied camp and the tracks of a group moving in a direction that led toward an area of broken rock and dense brush, terrain where the large unit could not pursue without fracturing. At that point, the pursuing force had to choose: attempt a risky descent into unknown ground, or fall back and wait for reinforcements. Often they chose the latter, and the band was gone on the wind. There were periods of concentrated effort when commanders gathered many columns with the hope of finally containing a band. These campaigns multiplied the environmental pressures on both sides. Supply lines extended, scout parties proliferated, and the risk of detection grew for the smaller group. Yet even these so-called final drives could be undermined by a single misread of the ground. A dry arroyo misjudged as passable would funnel horses into poor footing. A ridge thought to be a minor barrier turned out to have a series of hidden hollows. The land had its own agency, and it often favored those who had lived in it for generations. Ultimately, campaigns and pursuits in the Southwest were as much a study of endurance and knowledge as they were of firepower. Hard terrain rewarded local intelligence, small units, and flexible tactics. Armies adapted by learning to fragment their forces into faster, more autonomous detachments, by employing native scouts, and by leveraging communications where possible. The Apache, including Geronimo's band, used every advantage the landscape yielded: concealment, mobility, and the intimate memory of water and shelter. The clash between organized forces and mobile bands in a landscape so uncompromising left behind stories of near misses, daring escapes, tense negotiations, and the slow wearing down of a way of life. There is a quiet lesson in that wear. Campaigns that span years rarely end with a single decisive moment. They resolve through accumulations, constrained choices, lost springs, exhausted animals, shifting loyalties. The Southwest's hard country did not care for either side. It only shaped their conduct. And in that shaping, the terrain was the constant, the decisive factor that made the Apache resistance both possible and, finally, so costly. Thank you for listening. If this held your attention, please consider subscribing for more histories told in a calm, narrative voice. negotiations, betrayals, and broken promises. Hello, thank you for listening. If this kind of careful history interests you, consider subscribing for more stories told with attention and care. During the 19th century, the language of negotiation between the Apache and the United States government often sounded like assurance but behaved like a trap. Promises were made at campfires and on dusty parade grounds. Officials spoke of rations, protection, and sanctioned land. Apache leaders spoke of home, safety, and the right to hunt. Those conversations frequently ended with people being moved, leaders taken, or food withheld. Simple words, agree, return, surrender, carried consequences far heavier than anyone who uttered them publicly acknowledged. The first betrayals did not occur in a courtroom. They happened at the edge of a tent, over a meal, during a meeting arranged so that one side could be arrested. One well-known incident began when a military officer accused a respected leader of wrongdoing and invited him to parley. The officer then tried to seize the leader by force. The result was not a fair trial but a cascade of retaliatory raids and reprisals that widened a small incident into years of conflict. The technique reappeared in different forms: a promise of safe conduct used to gather hostages, an official escort that turned into imprisonment, a meeting that became an ambush. These were tactical betrayals, and they reverberated through Apache communities for generations. Negotiations under generals such as the one who preferred diplomacy over force produced short-lived peace. He would roam into Mexico to parley with bands, promising food and the right to return to certain valleys if the raiding stopped. Those missions were complicated by international borders. Mexico had its own interests and its own soldiers. Sometimes Mexican commanders agreed to cooperate, and sometimes they did not. A truce signed by one commander might be ignored by the next. The Apache operated across what later became a tightly policed frontier. Their world predated that line. Treaties and agreements that did not respect mobility and seasonal needs were bound to fail. Apache leaders who accepted terms on the assumption that their people could continue to follow traditional routes found those assumptions shattered when hungry families were crowded into a single, unfamiliar place. Reservations were presented as a solution, land where the Apache could be guaranteed supplies and protection. In practice, reservations often became cages. Promises of regular food turned into missed shipments and bureaucratic delays. The agency system, that is, the federal officers and agents assigned to manage relations, proved inconsistent. Some agents were humane and tried to fulfill commitments. Others were indifferent or corrupt. Livestock meant livelihood for many Apache, and when cattle and horses were stolen by settlers, miners, or rustlers, army patrols sometimes failed to intervene. A promise to protect a band from settlers too often meant little more than words on a ledger. Over time, this pattern, make a promise, fail to back it up, then punish those who protested, became a ritual that convinced many Apache leaders that any agreement was precarious at best. One of the most painful forms of betrayal was the forced removal of families after assurances had been given. Leaders who agreed to come in, to accept rations, and to place their young people in mission schools did so with an expectation of reciprocity. Instead, surrendering bands sometimes found themselves treated as prisoners. Men who had put down arms were counted among forced removals to distant camps in unfamiliar climates. The exile was presented as necessary for pacification and, later, as a humanitarian measure. It was explained as protection against settler violence. For many Apache, there was no protection there, only the sudden, permanent separation from ancestral valleys. The language of negotiation, sign here, move there, obscured the reality that people were being removed from the lands that anchored their lives. Promises also met betrayal when authorities used Apache scouts to hunt their own people. Scouts were often recruited from among tribes or bands who had already settled on reservations. They were promised pay, status, and sometimes land. Yet their service could put them in the terrible position of tracking relatives and neighbors. Officers relied on scouts' knowledge of terrain and tactics, and this made certain negotiations feel like traps from the start. To accept a camp of negotiators with soldiers and scouts in attendance was to accept a risk that the meeting could be a pretense for arrests. Many Apache learned to distrust not only the government but also some of the very people it used to enforce its will. Local violence from settlers and vigilantes further eroded trust in negotiated agreements. When news came that a community had been attacked, even while under supposed protection, the condemnation was slow and the compensation scarce. Sometimes local juries declined to convict perpetrators. Sometimes indictments were never issued. The failure of law at the local level sent a singular message. Official promises might exist, but they would not necessarily be enforced when the political will tilted another way. The campground incident is a blunt example. Families who had come in, seeking the safety of peace and subsistence, were slaughtered by a force that included local citizens and allies. The federal response focused less on justice for the victims and more on whether policies needed revision. For many in the Apache community, this was not mere failure, it was a decisive and chilling betrayal. Military leaders who sought different approaches sometimes negotiated in earnest. One general believed in treating Apache leaders as partners rather than mere foes. He employed Apache scouts, negotiated in Mexico, and attempted to secure agreements by recognizing customary rights. Yet even his efforts were constrained by politics back home. Pressure from the public, who demanded safety for frontier settlements, and from politicians, who wanted quick solutions, meant that a more humane or flexible policy could be overturned by another general or by congressional directives. The result was a cycle. A conciliatory commander could win short-term agreements, only for a successor to bring a harder line and reverse or reinterpret promises. On the Mexican side, negotiations were equally fraught. Mexican authorities faced their own limitations and often viewed Apache movement as a criminal problem rather than a political one. At times, Mexican forces made deals with certain Apache groups, promising sanctuary if raids ceased. At other times, raids were met by summary reprisal, and alliances with local trackers or militia resulted in kidnappings and exchanges. Cross-border pursuit complicated matters legally and ethically. The United States claimed the right to pursue raiders into Mexican territory, sometimes with Mexican acquiescence. But the Mexican state's reach was uneven. When Mexican commanders made bargains in one region, bands in another did not necessarily honor them, and the result was confusion and further reasons for the Apache to distrust any negotiated assurance. Geronimo's own experience epitomizes this swirl of negotiation and betrayal. He had reasons to distrust talk that led to confinement. His decisions to return to raiding were often explained afterward by a pattern he had learned: agree to come in for safety and food, find that food scant and safety absent, then be punished when people left to find what they needed. Surrender was not always a final word. It could be a temporary retreat. It could also be a prelude to exile. Leaders who agreed to terms and later found those terms broken had to ask themselves, whom could they trust? The answer was often no one beyond their own band. The status of surrendered Apache as either prisoners of war or as wards of the state was itself a point of betrayal. Promises that surrender would restore families to their lands clashed with orders that portrayed surrendered bands as captives to be relocated far away. Once labeled prisoners, they lost certain legal protections and were transported to military posts in climates that were unfamiliar and harsh. The logic given by authorities leaned on the notion that dispersing potential troublemakers would secure peace. Those decisions ignored the depth of loss that such dispersal entailed. In countless cases, leaders who negotiated in good faith ended up watching their people taken to places thousands of miles from home. To name one concrete example, bands that surrendered expecting to remain in their home regions were sometimes loaded onto army wagons and moved across great distances, toward forts along the Gulf. The journey itself was degrading. The destination, for many, was worse. Medical care was variable, rations were inconsistent, and the climate could be deadly for people accustomed to a desert life. Promises that surrender would mean resettlement in a way that honored traditions and autonomy dissolved into an institutional policy of containment. When leaders later petitioned to return home, their appeals were denied, delayed, or redirected. That denial was a final form of betrayal, not an accidental failure but a decision to enforce a new order, one that prioritized colonial settlement and control over negotiated return. The role of the press and of politicians cannot be overlooked. Public opinion often demanded a forceful end to raids, and newspapers depicted Apache resistance as barbarism rather than the outcome of betrayal. Politicians responded with rhetoric that called for decisive action. Under that pressure, military commanders found compromise harder to justify. Negotiations that might have held if given time and trust were short-circuited by a hunger for swift justice. Promises intended to calm a volatile situation were replaced by orders to capture, disarm, and relocate. For the Apache, each broken promise reinforced the sense that negotiation meant submission to an inexorable transformation of their world. Yet even amid these betrayals, negotiators sometimes showed genuine concern, and not all officers or administrators behaved uniformly. There were episodes of kindness and attempts at fair treatment. Officers interceded to return stolen livestock in some places. Aid arrived after certain shortages. But those exceptions could not overcome the overall pattern. When the state's bureaucratic machine failed, when agents diverted supplies, or when local juries absolved attackers, goodwill was not sufficient. Trust required consistency more than occasional benevolence. The consequences of the cycle of promises and betrayals were deep. They shaped decisions on the ground, whether to accept terms, whether to resist, whom to trust. They reshaped family structures through forced migrations and incarcerations. They eroded the possibilities of coexistence by teaching that agreements could safely be made only at the price of ongoing vigilance. The Apache response, therefore, should be read as a defense of autonomy under conditions that had few fair choices. Finally, the moral landscape of these negotiations matters because it left legacies that persisted long after the last shots were fired. Broken promises became part of communal memory, a cautionary tale passed down. Leaders like Geronimo became symbols not only of resistance but of a refusal to accept a system that negotiated peace on terms that did not include reciprocity or real protection. When future generations look back, the negotiations read less like legal transactions and more like a ledger of trust squandered. That ledger contained entries of explicit pledges and implicit expectations, and too often, it was balanced by the hard fact of betrayal. There is no neat reconciliation in these pages. What can be said clearly is that negotiations, when stripped of honor and follow-through, do not resolve conflict so much as displace it. The Apache experience during this era shows how fragile any settlement is when one side controls the means of enforcement and the other side controls the land. Words then became a kind of violence, promises weaponized into policies that uprooted lives. It was a lesson that echoed across the Southwest, shaping how communities moved, how leaders made choices, and how history would remember the last great resistance in that region. Life on the run, endurance and strategy. During the 19th century, the desert and mountain country of the Southwest became not just a battleground but a living instrument in the hands of those who knew it best. Hello. If you find this close look compelling, please consider subscribing for more stories told this way. Geronimo, known in his language as Goyali, and the small bands that followed him turned survival into a practiced art, and that art was born of necessity, observation, and a willingness to move without predictable patterns. The first requirement was mobility. Horses were everything, the measure of freedom, the key to escape, the storehouse of speed. An Apache rider could cross broken terrain faster than a pursuing cavalry unit, and horses were treated with careful attention. They were fed by hand, kept within quick reach at night, and rotated so that a tired lead horse could be left behind and a fresher one mounted. Raiders took horses not only to ride but to transport children and blankets and dried meat. When a band moved, they did so in staggered lines that reduced the chance of being spotted at a distance. Travel by day was conservative. By night they could traverse more ground unseen, or use the low light of dawn and dusk to slip across ridgelines. Silence was cultivated, the clinking of tack was muffled, and scouts walked ahead and behind the main group to warn of patrols or fresh tracks. Water dictated routes in a region where springs and cienagas were sparse and often seasonal. Apache scouts memorized the location of every reliable source within 100 miles. They knew which gulches held clear pools even after a week without rain. When a waterhole was discovered, small teams would make discreet forays to replenish supplies, leaving behind decoys or signs to mislead trackers. Knowledge of seasonal flows, where a stream swelled after distant storms and where a spring shrank to a trickle, was not folklore but tactical intelligence. This understanding allowed them to vanish into a landscape that to outsiders often looked empty and dead. Food strategies combined planning with opportunism. Dried meat, often jerky sun-cured and smoked, traveled well and furnished concentrated calories. Corn and mesquite beans were staple stores when bands could carry them. Foraging remained indispensable. Mescal, the roasted heart of the agave plant, could be found in rocky draws. Piñon nuts were a seasonal windfall. Rabbits and birds could be snared or trapped quietly. Small parties would split to forage while the main group hid in shaded canyons. They carried minimal cookware and favored quick cooking methods, stones heated in coals to warm water, or thin flatbread cooked directly on a heated rock. Hunting was mindful of footprints. Trails that led to frequent kills were abandoned once the enemy began to anticipate them. Speedy raids on isolated supply trains, stagecoaches, or ranch outbuildings supplied fresh horses and provisions when needed, and were planned to minimize confrontation. Clothing and gear were optimized for endurance. Moccasins allowed silent movement and provided surprising traction on slick rock. Buckskin shirts protected against wind and cold at elevation while breathing well during long days. Blankets were compacted tightly and layered to conserve heat during high desert nights where temperatures dropped drastically. Because weight slowed flight, each item was tested for utility. A spare rawhide lariat could be weapon, tow, or repair cord. A hunting bow was lighter than a carbine and quieter. Women in the bands were indispensable in maintaining gear, curing hides, and packing supplies, and they often organized camps so that a waking hour could be spent mounting and slipping away if scouts returned with trouble. Movement patterns were deliberately irregular. Leaders like Geronimo practiced deception. They sometimes doubled back along a route to confuse trackers or intentionally left shoe marks on a parallel trail so pursuers followed a false lead. They favored passes that funneled enemy troops into predictable paths and then used alternate, lesser-known cuts to escape. When a small detachment encountered a military column, the band usually dispersed. Splinter groups would break into smaller units that could move faster and find concealment in the maze of boulder-strewn canyons. Reunification points were set in advance. Rock overhangs, a particular juniper stump, a bend in a dry wash, places perfectly described in memory so the group could come back together without signaling. Scouting and early warning systems were sophisticated. A network of lookouts, youths or the older, less mobile people, cast eyes from high ridges and signaled with smoke by day and mirrored light by night. In tougher country, runners could cover surprising distances in a single day. Language and signals were concise. A particular arrangement of stones near a spring could mean danger, come back, while a rearranged twig might mark a safe route forward. Apache scouts sometimes served both sides, offering tracking skills to U.S. units at times, but loyalty was complex and often pragmatic. The same knowledge that allowed a scout to guide an army through a pass also enabled his people to disappear. Tactical flexibility extended to how engagements were chosen. Bands avoided pitched battles. Where possible, they struck at isolated targets, outlying ranches, small military supply wagons, or small detachments, where the balance of surprise favored them. Quick raids were designed to secure horses, ammunition, or food and then vanish before a larger force could assemble. When required, they set ambushes in narrow defiles where cavalry could not maneuver well and where the high ground conferred advantage. They used the land to amplify their numbers. A small party could seem like more by attacking from several directions in quick succession, giving the impression of a larger force and thus catalyzing confusion. Mental endurance was as crucial as the physical. Living on the run meant constant decision-making under stress. Leaders balanced immediate survival against long-term cohesion. If a raiding party returned with prisoners or captured stock, the band had to decide whether to keep moving to avoid pursuit or stay to care for the wounded or young. Discipline was necessary. The Apache practiced quiet, and that quiet included an internal code. Waste was scorned, every horse had a place. Children were made part of the movement so that they grew up knowing how to sleep in a canyon and how to silence a camp at a moment's notice. Storytelling in the evenings consolidated knowledge. Elders passed down routes and tactics. These stories contain the names of springs, the quality of mule tracks, the time it took to cross a particular mesa from one shade to another. Logistics were creative. When ammunition ran low, bands scavenged old forts, caches, or the remnants of abandoned camps. Trade and barter remained tools. Some Apache traded harvested goods or skins with sympathetic or neutral Mexicans and Americans who preferred to stay out of larger conflicts. Others cleverly used the official system, showing up at a fort or reservation to receive rations or supplies, then leaving as soon as they could. Such behavior was often misread as cooperation. In truth, it was a survival tactic. Temporary surrender was sometimes chosen because it offered a chance to resupply and regroup, only to slip away again when conditions permitted. Terrain knowledge extended beyond the visible. Underground springs, sinkholes, and seasonal gullies were all mapped in memory. Apache trackers read subtle signs, the direction of bent grass to indicate recent passage, the smudge pattern of a fire for age, the presence of flies as a clue to a recent kill or encampment. These small cues allowed them to determine how recently a route had been used and whether it was safe. If a military column had crossed a windswept plain 2 hours earlier, the scouts could tell by the weight of the dust and the pattern in which hoofprints were packed. That sensitivity to detail meant that the band could make split-second choices about whether to approach a waterhole or find another. Solid leadership was a quiet force. Geronimo's authority lay not merely in charisma but in demonstrated competence. Decisions were explained, not imposed. Choices were made in council more often than in command. That form of decision-making kept morale intact and permitted elders and women to voice concerns about the well-being of non-combatants. Commanders had to think like hunters, not like generals. Their job was to keep people alive and moving, not to seize and hold ground. Communication with outside allies was subtle. Letters were seldom used. Instead, trusted runners or intermediaries would shuttle messages to traders, certain Mexican ranchers, or other Apache bands. Alliances were fluid. A temporary understanding with another clan could mean access to fresh grazing grounds or a safe crossing of a river. When alliances were formed, they were often cemented by kinship ties, marriage or adoption, that made cooperation more durable. Conversely, betrayal could force entire bands onto new migratory patterns to reduce contact and vulnerability. Psychological tactics were deployed to heighten uncertainty among pursuers. A sudden disappearance from a visible ridge suggested supernatural knowledge to some settler communities, but to the Apache it was careful timing. At times a small group would remain in sight to draw attention, leading pursuers into a slope of boulders where another group waited. At other times they would deliberately leave tracks that diverged in 3 directions to slow down a systematic tracking party. These feints were designed to buy not just minutes but the kind of confusion that turned pursuit into a series of false leads. The human cost of constant movement was real. Children learned to sleep through the rattle of tack. Elders sometimes could not keep up and needed extra animals for transport. Yet even these hardships were integrated into tactical thinking. Elders were respected carriers of knowledge, and their presence could be a strategic asset, enough reason to avoid desperate stands but also an anchor that required more strategic planning to ensure safety. Women's roles encompassed more than caretaking. They were scouts, negotiators, and organizers. Their ability to prepare dried food quickly and to pack a camp in moments mattered to the survival of the group. Adaptation to changing technology was another axis of endurance. As firearms became more common, Apache tactics adjusted. They favored close-range engagements and ambushes that negated the longer-range accuracy of a rifle, and they continued to prize mobility to avoid the heavier logistical tail that modern armies brought. When telegraph lines or military roads appeared, bands altered their routes to remain off the grid. The rail line that moved men and material through new obstacles into their world, but the combination of knowledge, flexibility, and the capacity to disappear into mountains or cross an international border kept resistance alive for years longer than many expected. Negotiation and survival were intertwined. Surrender statements, truces, and paroles were sometimes tools to gain time or regroup. Leaders studied the terms on offer, weighed the possibility of humane treatment against the certainty of starvation or confinement, and made choices accordingly. The line between survival strategy and simple day-to-day logistics blurred. A safe camp tonight was as valuable as a temporary ceasefire if it meant more children would survive the winter. When pursued by larger forces, Apache bands used the landscape as both shield and storehouse. Caves and overhangs offered concealment, but they were also cold and vulnerable places for the young. So, camps were rarely static for long. They used a system of trade-offs. Pick a place that offered water and concealment but required a long approach that would wear down pursuers, or choose shallow cover near supplies and risk quicker detection. Each choice came with consequences. Finally, endurance was a cultural practice as much as a tactic. Stories recounted not only victories but the methods used to preserve life, how to read the sky for wind, which plants to roast to soothe an upset stomach, how to break a horse without risking injury to the rider. These were passed down in evenings by the fire, woven into songs and sayings that functioned as mnemonic devices. The line between practical lesson and cultural memory was thin. A proverb about staying low or waiting for the moon to set might encode a crucial survival rule. This way of life, mobile, attentive, and patient, brought with it a certain dignity. There was no pretense that the land was merely background. It was a partner. Land itself, with its canyons and sparse springs, shaped choices and produced strategies born from restraint and resourcefulness. Theirs was not a simple resistance of constant confrontation. It was a long game of endurance, of outliving and outthinking a better-equipped foe, of using the rhythms of night and water and stone to sustain a people who refused to be enclosed. And so, each dawn became a rehearsal for movement, each evening a ledger of survival. It was a life that demanded precision and care, but also creativity and courage. In those habits, of choosing a path, of tending a horse, of hiding a single, crucial footprint, the story of resistance becomes, plain as the red rock cliffs, a story of how people endured and how strategy was born from intimate knowledge of a land that could both give and conceal. The final surrender. Hello. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive, please subscribe for more stories like this. During the final months of Geronimo's flight, small bands of soldiers and trackers closed the circle a little tighter with every patrol. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with the pursuit. Narrow canyons, mesas that caught a sky that could be merciless by day and bone-stealing cold by night. Geronimo had long mastered moving through that country. He knew every arroyo and ridge, every hidden spring. Yet even expert knowledge of terrain has limits when hemming in depends on patience, reconnaissance, and the steady pressure of numbers and resources. The United States Army, reinforced and better supplied, had learned lessons from earlier campaigns and adapted its approach. Those adaptations, improved logistics, the use of native scouts who understood desert tracking, and a shift in leadership strategy, helped bring the chase to a close. Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood is central to the final act. He was not merely a soldier with orders. He was a negotiator who had worked with Apache scouts and who could speak enough Apache to bridge, briefly, the gulf between warrior and officer. Gatewood's presence mattered in two ways. He helped locate Geronimo, and he offered a human voice amid the tension. The composition of forces that cornered Geronimo combined U.S. troops and Apache scouts, a coalition that undercut any safe havens across the borderlands. The scouts were native men, often from other Apache bands, who served the army as trackers. Their knowledge of the land and of Apache tactics was decisive. They did something more than follow tracks. They read patterns of supply and movement, and they helped shape the terms of surrender discussions that would follow. Negotiations were delicate. Geronimo and his small party were exhausted by months of constant movement. Supplies were thin. The psychological toll of unending vigil and the knowledge that the army could sustain a campaign longer than any one band could was a factor he could not ignore. But exhaustion alone did not compel the surrender. What tipped the balance was a mixture of diplomacy and the strategic pressure of encirclement. Gatewood approached Geronimo's camp with a tone that mixed firmness and respect. He offered assurances that the exercise of turning themselves in would prevent further bloodshed. Geronimo was wary. He had been promised things before and had watched promises fracture. That mistrust shaped every exchange. Yet Gatewood's manner, and the logic of diminishing options, softened resistance enough for an accord to be reached. The weapons were not displayed in a melodramatic tableau. Instead, the act of surrender was pragmatic. Small gestures, the handing over of a firearm or a token, and then the formal words that concluded a long, fraught chapter. Once Geronimo accepted the terms, a serious transformation unfolded. He and the people with him became prisoners of war in the eyes of the federal government. That status mattered legally and practically. Prisoners of war lost certain freedoms and were subject to transportation and internment away from their homelands. For the Chiricahua and other affected Apache groups, this meant being uprooted from the familiar hills and canyons that shaped their lives. The army moved the surrendered groups to military custody and then onward to distant internment locations in the southeast of the continent. The purpose, from the government perspective, was to prevent further uprisings by removing the most determined fighters from the region. For those forced to relocate, the purpose was felt as exile from ancestral places. The trip east was more than a long march. It was a slow unspooling of a culture's autonomy. Travel by rail and wagon brought Geronimo's band into environments specific to the eastern United States. Damp air, unfamiliar vegetation, and far shorter daylight in winter months than the southwestern deserts to which they were accustomed. The contrast was sharp. Men who once lived and fought among arroyos and saguaros found themselves under the watchful eyes of soldiers in forts near coasts and in swampy barracks. Many accounts describe a bewilderment that followed. Routines and rhythms of daily life were interrupted, and the social structures that had held communities together had to adapt to confined and regulated conditions. Families continued to care for one another, to keep stories alive across generations. Yet the political and spiritual wounds of being held as prisoners in distant forts ran deep. Public reaction to the surrender varied, and the surrender itself quickly entered into national consciousness. Newspapers spun narratives that alternately celebrated the Army's achievement and fed sensational stories about frontier danger finally being controlled. Photographs and portraits of Geronimo circulated. Some observers treated him as a dangerous rebel finally brought to heel. Others saw in him a tragic symbol of resistance and loss. These competing frames shape how the American public remembered the episode. For Native communities, the surrender and subsequent exile became a symbol of betrayal, and for soldiers who had chased him, it was the end of a long campaign that tested tactics and endurance. The image of the final surrender lodged in print and in the popular imagination, sometimes stripped of nuance and context, and often used to justify further policies of assimilation and removal. Legal and political consequences followed in the wake of the military action. The federal government's decision to treat Geronimo and his people as prisoners meant that ordinary peace treaties and reservation policies did not apply in the same way. Exile was an administrative tool. It enabled authorities to avoid immediate negotiations over land and return. The legal framework around prisoners carried implications for rights and for the eventual fate of the Chiricahua. Over time, postal petitions and appeals were filed on behalf of displaced families, but those efforts met slow reception and shifting priorities. The bureaucracy that managed Native affairs was uneven and often heavy-handed, and the status of prisoners in exile complicated any attempt at a straightforward resolution that would allow people to return home. Geronimo's own stance after surrender reveals the complexity of his character. He was no one-note villain or romantic hero. He was a leader who had fought for autonomy and survival. In his later years under custody, he became a figure of paradox, admired, feared, and exploited in turn. He was brought into contact with soldiers and officials who alternately tried to manage him and to profit from public interest. He accepted some opportunities under tight constraints. At the same time, he never fully relaxed the vigilance that had sustained him through years of flight. His presence in the East, in forts, and in staged exhibitions that sometimes exploited native performers, turned him into a person both observed and studied. He was photographed, and the images spread in newspapers and postcards. Those images carried more than a likeness. They embodied a narrative about the taming of the frontier and the transformation of conflict into spectacle. For the Apache peoples, the final surrender marked an end to one chapter of armed resistance, but not an end to cultural resilience. The forced removals altered family networks and clan structures, yet elders and storytellers guarded the memory of the years of resistance, of the strategies, and of the reasons families took the risks they did. Even as communities were held in distant forts and then moved between camps, they found ways to keep language, songs, and spiritual practices alive. The exile could not erase memory, though it imposed an immense cost. Later generations would recall both the loss and the continuity that followed exile. Policies that separated children from elders, or that pressured assimilation, left scars. Yet traditions endured in quieter ways, in private ceremonies, in language whispered across hearths, in the adaptation of old stories to new landscapes. The surrender also influenced military practice and policy. The Army's handling of a long manhunt, its use of scouts, and the conduct of negotiations informed future campaigns across the continent. Officers debated the balance between force and diplomacy, and the episode contributed to evolving standards for interacting with indigenous leaders. The strategies that had finally brought Geronimo to terms, careful tracking, patience, and targeted diplomacy, became part of a playbook that field commanders studied. But commanders also had to reckon with the long-term political consequences of exile. The removal of resisting leaders created short-term calm, but it did not solve broader grievances about land, sovereignty, and rights. Those unresolved issues would fuel future conflicts in other regions, though the open wars of the Southwest had seen their most determined organized leader put into custody. The human detail of the moment of surrender resists dramatic simplification. There was no single dramatically staged capitulation. Instead, it unfolded in a series of conversations and small movements. A warrior put a rifle aside. A child watched. A scout stood nearby, stoic. An officer promised, and the promise was fragile. That fragile promise was broken in practice when exile followed. Still, those small acts contained weight. They represented a choice by Geronimo to end a campaign that had cost lives on all sides and to preserve the lives of those who traveled with him. That choice was agonizing, and it resonates in testimonies from both Apache survivors and soldiers. Voices recorded later recalled weariness. They spoke of a leader who had carried the burden of difficult decisions and who finally chose, for the sake of his people, a pause in armed resistance. After the surrender, life in captivity framed much of what followed. The practicalities of food, shelter, and medical care were managed by the Army, but under conditions set by military command, not by the communities themselves. Cultural practices that depended on open land and seasonal cycles faced interruption. Religious ceremonies were constrained. The physical separation from ancestral territories cut deep at the social level. Yet, amidst the hardships, small acts of cultural continuity kept people rooted. Crafts were made, stories were told, and children learned language. Letters and petitions from relatives who remained in the Southwest tried to negotiate a return. Their pleas were heard, but slowly and in fragments. The final surrender did not erase the complexities of the frontier. It closed one stage of active resistance in the Southwest, but it opened other conversations about how the nation would integrate, govern, or marginalize indigenous peoples. For historians and descendants, the surrender has continued to be a focal point for discussion about justice and memory. It raises questions about how to reckon with promises made and broken, and how to remember acts of resistance and concession without simplifying them into a single moral tale. For many Native communities, The surrender is a chapter that must be read alongside the resilience that followed, a resilience that survived exile and returned in memory, language, and culture. The final years of Geronimo's life under custody reframed his public image. He was photographed, he met officials, and he became a figure in the spectacle of national memory. Yet, behind public appearances, there remained the quiet fact that he had given up his freedom for the sake of his followers. He never regained a sovereign homeland to lead from. His presence at military posts and in public events served a complicated end. A man once feared as an enemy now paraded as a trophy and consulted as a curiosity. Those contradictions are part of why the moment of surrender continues to hold attention. It reveals the messy intersection of power, honor, and survival. Even now, the final surrender resonates as a study in negotiation under duress, in the limits of armed resistance when confronted by a state with greater resources, and in the personal toll exacted on leaders who carry the weight of collective choices. It was an ending of a particular struggle, but not the end of remembrance or identity. The places Geronimo and his people left behind remained in their stories, and those stories would guide future demands for rights, recognition, and return. The surrender closed a battlefield chapter. It left open the longer, quieter contest over memory, dignity, and justice that has continued into the present. Aftermath, captivity, and public myth. During the 19th century, the end of armed resistance did not mean freedom. After Geronimo and the small bands with him gave up the last long run through rugged mesas and borderlands, their captivity began in earnest, and that captivity became the material out of which a public myth was forged. Hello, thank you for listening, and if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into overlooked histories, consider subscribing for more stories like this. The story that followed was equal parts confinement, negotiation, and performance, and it altered how Americans, and the world beyond, came to know both one man and the broader Apache experience. Geronimo's removal from his homeland was a displacement in the starkest sense. Taken far from familiar canyons, he and his people were placed in military custody where the structures and rhythms of Apache life were stripped away. Prison sites in the southeast were humid and foreign, and later stations in the plains presented a different, but no less alien, landscape. The move denied access to ancestral burial grounds, seasonal rounds, and the social networks that sustained Apache communities. For the captives, this was not simply loss of territory. It was the hard unraveling of daily life. Children grew up without learning some of the land's roots. Elders were separated from graves they could not tend. Basic needs were overseen by an army whose priorities were containment and assimilation rather than cultural continuity. Disease and the stress of enforced immobility took a toll, with many dying far from home. These were quiet calamities, the sort that seldom make the dramatic pages of war tales but that reshape generations. As the living conditions settled into a grim routine, the American public's appetite for stories about the frontier did not subside. Newspapers, photographers, and traveling entertainments needed faces and narratives. Geronimo's name, already feared, admired, reviled, and revered in different circles, fit neatly into popular frameworks. What the press and popular culture offered was not a portrait of a man in context, but a series of simplified roles: the irrepressible outlaw, the noble savage, the broken prisoner. Photographers, military and commercial, took images that would be reproduced widely as carts to visit and postcards. Those images circulated across the nation and overseas. In them, Geronimo often appears stoic, wrapped in garments that mix the traditional with garments provided or staged by military handlers. Such pictures were powerful because they could be read in more than one way. For some viewers, they were proof of conquest. For others, they were tokens of exoticism. The visual economy turned a human life into a symbol, and that symbol proved remarkably portable. The military itself treated Geronimo as both a captive and as a convenient emblem. Keeping him under guard served immediate security goals. But the army and civic authorities also recognized that the man who had eluded capture and led dramatic raids could be useful in promoting narratives of closure, that the frontier had been adjudicated, that the nation's project of expansion had a face. At public events, at local fairs, and in Washington receptions that the press covered, appearances by Geronimo or by other Apache prisoners were framed as spectacles of victory. He was sometimes paraded before politicians, photographers, or small delegations. He was alternately vilified in print and asked to perform his acceptance of captivity. The contradictions here are instructive. A people were denied self-determination on the premise of civilizing or pacifying them, while the very figurehead of resistance was turned into proof that those aims had been achieved. The political use of his image helped cement a national myth of manifest destiny. even as it glossed over the human costs paid by the Apache and others. Popular entertainments fed the appetite for frontier drama and further complicated Geronimo's post-war image. Traveling shows and dime novels required villains and heroes in tidy archetypes, and they borrowed liberally from real events and real people while reshaping them beyond recognition. Some Apache prisoners and relatives participated in paid performances. They found money, however small, and a certain agency in choosing to display skills and dress for audiences. Geronimo himself, however, mostly resisted becoming a paid performer. That refusal, quiet and principled, became part of his legend too, reframed by writers and promoters into narratives about pride and stoicism. At the same time, portrayals in print and on stage often erased important context: why resistance had been undertaken in the first place, how alliances among tribes and nations had shifted, and how federal Indian policy had created conditions of chronic insecurity. The myth cycle turned complex negotiations into a morality play that comforted a nation but distorted realities. Within captivity, Geronimo exerted what control he could. He negotiated with military officers, advocated on behalf of his people, and sometimes leveraged the public attention around him to press for small improvements in diet or privacy for families. He gave interviews and spoke through interpreters. In doing so, he entered a fraught media environment in which every utterance could be mined, misquoted, or sensationalized. The language barrier and the power imbalance meant that controlling the narrative was never fully possible, but such acts of engagement were not mere accommodation. They were strategies for survival. Family leaders sought to preserve as much of their social fabric as the camp rules would allow, pressing to maintain ceremonial life, to marry, to bury the dead properly, and to teach children the Apache tongue. Those intimate acts of cultural persistence were overshadowed by headlines, but they mattered as much as any negotiation with officers. Death in captivity carried its own set of consequences. When Geronimo eventually died while still away from his homeland, the place of burial became another contested site of memory. He was interred on lands controlled by the military. For officials, that grave reinforced the narrative of closure. For family and later generations, it was a painful marker of exile. Over the decades, descendants and community members have sought different forms of recognition: requests for repatriation, ceremonies to honor ancestors, and calls for more truthful public history. These efforts reveal how memory is not static. Monuments or graves can be used to freeze a story in a shape that suits one audience while infuriating another. The enduring questions about where a person belongs after death, whose right it is to care for remains, who decides how history is commemorated, are still being answered in courts, among scholars, and at kitchen tables among family members. The public myth that formed around Geronimo did more than fix an image. It influenced policy and public sentiment. Leaders used his story to justify punitive measures against other indigenous peoples, offering his submission as an argument that armed resistance would not succeed. Simultaneously, artists and writers seized on Geronimo as an emblem of an imagined frontier virtuescape, a solitary warrior standing against modernity. Both uses are selective. They romanticize certain traits, bravery, endurance, while rendering invisible the deeper causes of conflict, dispossession, treaty betrayals, and the everyday violence of enforced dependency. Indigenous intellectuals and community historians have worked to reclaim Geronimo's life from those reductive frames, emphasizing his roles as husband, father, spiritual person, and leader, making desperate choices under conditions of siege. Photographs, postcards, and biographies crystallized particular images. Museums and popular histories reproduce them, often without sufficient context. Over time, a cottage industry of films, television shows, and fictional books reshape his likeness again and again. Each reimagining was an interpretation, and each interpretation said as much about the society producing it as about the man himself. For many Americans, the name became less a person than a shorthand: courage, danger, or a frontier overcome. For the Apache and for other native peoples, it remained, and remains, the story of a leader who did his best in impossible circumstances. That dissonance between symbol and lived person lies at the heart of the aftermath. There were quieter outcomes too, local and personal. Children born in captivity grew up torn between two worlds: stories from elders about canyon knowledge and seasonal rounds, and the rigid schedules and schooling imposed by military overseers. Language loss crept in where fluency could not be fully transmitted. Ceremonies were interrupted. The social scaffolding that had once supported identity and health was frayed. These effects did not vanish when formal imprisonment ended. They resonated across decades, influencing family structures and community resilience. Generations would still speak of the displacement as lived memory, and that continuity shaped political claims and cultural revitalization movements decades later. Attempts at reinterpretation have multiplied. Scholars, indigenous writers, and curators have worked to dismantle the myths and replace them with richer, more accurate narratives. They foreground oral histories, military records, photographs with provenance, and the artifacts of everyday life to show what living in captivity actually meant. Exhibits now try to present nuanced panels, not a single heroic or villainous face, but a life embedded in community, in law, in the shifting priorities of a nation expanding its borders. That work is not merely corrective. It changes how descendants and the public imagine justice, repatriation, and reconciliation. The public fascination with Geronimo also left practical legacies. The commodification of his image set precedents in how indigenous figures could be marketed. Postcards and photographs became souvenirs. They were sold to tourists who wanted a piece of the West. This commercialization created moral and economic problems. Families saw their relatives' images circulated without consent. Companies profited while offering little to the communities depicted. The ethical questions raised by those practices echo into the present debates about cultural property, copyright, and consent in the representation of indigenous peoples. In the end, the captivity and the myth-making around Geronimo illuminate the broader mechanics of empire, how states contain resistance, how they narrate conquest, and how private industry embellishes and sells that narrative back to the public. A man who once moved stealthily across borderlands became a stationary spectacle. His identity was increasingly shaped by the frames of others. Yet he was never only a symbol. Descendants, community historians, and many scholars insist on that point, reminding us that captivity cannot wholly erase personhood, that myth can be unpacked, and that memory can be reassembled to reflect fuller truths. What remains now is layered memory. Visitors to places where Geronimo lived or where he died encounter plaques, photographs, and artifacts. Some exhibits highlight his military resistance. Others emphasize life under modern pressure and the endurance of culture. Conversations about repatriation, historical accuracy, and the ethics of display continue. The past is not finished. It unfolds in each discussion about custody of artifacts, in every decision about how to teach schoolchildren, and in the ways communities choose to commemorate their ancestors. Geronimo's story after the fighting stopped asks us to pay attention to the long aftermath of conflict. Captivity was not a single event but an extended condition that reshaped bodies, families, and public imagination. The myths born there have been powerful and persistent, yet they are being challenged and revised. To approach the history honestly is to see both the spectacle and the sorrow, the strategic maneuvers and the small, stubborn acts of cultural care. In that interplay lies the true legacy, not the tidy legend printed on a postcard, but the complicated human story that echoes into the present. Closing reflection and legacy. When Apache resistance stretched across the Southwest, its consequences reached far beyond any single battlefield and settled into law, memory, and the landscape itself. Hello. If you find this kind of history meaningful, please subscribe for more thoughtful stories. The arc of Geronimo and the Apache Wars cannot be measured only in skirmishes. It must be read in policy changes, in communities remade, and in the ways a people held fast to identity under relentless pressure. The most immediate legacy was political and legal. The sustained resistance of Apache bands hardened federal approaches to indigenous affairs. Policies that defined reservations, controlled movement, and regulated daily life were not invented in isolation. They were responses to a frontier that many officials saw as ungovernable. Reservation in this context simply means land set aside by the government for native communities, often with limits imposed on how and where people could live. Sovereignty, another term used in these debates, means the right of a people to govern themselves. The Apache experience revealed the limits of both concepts in practice. Sovereignty was repeatedly compromised by military defeat and administrative control, and reservations became spaces more of containment than of self-determination. Cultural survival emerged as a quieter, yet equally powerful, strand of the legacy. Apache languages, songs, and ceremonial life persisted even as families were forced onto unfamiliar lands. Oral histories preserved accounts that official reports did not. These stories, passed from grandparents to children, kept alive a different record than newspapers or military dispatches. For many Apaches, survival was not measured by victory in war but by the ability to maintain kinship networks, to teach children the language, to hold ceremonies when possible. Those acts of cultural continuity meant that, despite displacement and incarceration, Apache identity did not end. It changed form, adapted, and continued. The human cost shaped social and economic realities that are still visible today. Forced relocations, the scarcity of grazing lands, and the disruption of traditional subsistence patterns produced long-term hardship. Reservation life, with limited economic opportunities, often led to cycles of poverty that successive generations have worked to break. At the same time, community-run programs, education in native languages, cultural revitalization projects, and locally governed enterprises illustrate resilience. Examples can be seen in Apache communities that operate cultural centers, run museums that tell their own history, and teach young people how to make traditional crafts and songs. These are not mere heritage projects, they are strategies for political survival and self-definition. Public memory and representation present another complicated legacy. In popular culture, Geronimo's image was flattened and repurposed repeatedly. He became a convenient symbol in dime novels and postcards, an emblem used to sell myths of the Wild West. Those portrayals often reduced complex motives to sensational narratives. Over time, however, scholarship and community voices have challenged these caricatures. Museums and historians have worked to present fuller accounts that place Geronimo within a web of family ties, spiritual beliefs, and legal constraints. The shift from caricature to context matters. It changes the way audiences understand resistance, as a human story about choices and consequences rather than a romanticized or demonized spectacle. Controversies about memory continue to reverberate. Debates have arisen over how remains and artifacts are treated, who has the right to keep or reclaim them, and how to honor those who suffered without exploiting their image. Repatriation efforts, attempts to return ancestral remains and sacred objects to communities, illustrate the ethical turn in public history and archaeology. Communities have argued, with growing legal support in many cases, that control over cultural patrimony should rest with the descendants and stewards of that heritage. Those arguments spring from a simple premise: respect for the living obligations that connect descendants to the dead. There is also a military and geopolitical echo to the story. Names and images from the Apache struggles have been repurposed in modern operations, speeches, and corporate branding. When a historical figure is invoked by state institutions or media, the choice reflects power as much as memory. For some, that invocation is an honor. For others, it is a painful reminder of how indigenous histories can be co-opted. Those divergent responses underscore that legacy is not singular. It is contested, and it changes depending on who is telling the story. On the legal front, the Apache Wars affected jurisprudence about prisoners, status, and citizenship. Some Apache who served as scouts for the army navigated complex identities, simultaneously negotiating survival with compromise, offering their skills to an institution that had earlier pursued them. The juxtaposition of resistance and collaboration complicates tidy moral judgments. It shows how people made difficult choices in constrained circumstances, a theme that appears again and again in colonial contexts worldwide. Educationally, the aftermath of those conflicts prompted efforts to teach and to misteach. Boarding schools and assimilation policies tried to erase native languages and customs, often with traumatic consequences. Yet those same decades saw the first seeds of native-led education movements that demanded self-determination in schooling. Today, many Apache programs emphasize bilingual education and culturally responsive curricula. Such efforts aim to repair the damage of earlier policies and to empower new generations with both traditional knowledge and contemporary tools. Community memory is often anchored in places. Sites where bands once camped, where negotiations occurred, and where people were incarcerated have become focal points for remembrance. Some of these places are protected, others remain contested or are privately owned. The work of preservation is ongoing. It is undertaken by tribal governments, by historians, by non-profit organizations, and by families who keep the memory alive. Travel to these sites can be an act of learning, but it can also be an exercise in humility, an invitation to listen rather than to dominate the narrative. The legacy has also inspired art, literature, and testimony. Poets, filmmakers, and novelists have drawn on Apache stories to explore loss, resilience, and moral complexity. In museums and galleries, contemporary artists reinterpret historical images to challenge lingering myths and to restore dignity. Those creative acts do more than memorialize. They reframe conversations about justice and about who gets to tell the story. Lastly, there is a living political legacy. Apache nations today continue to assert rights over land, water, education, and cultural practice. Legal struggles over jurisdiction, resource management, and treaty obligations are not mere echoes of the past. They They are active negotiations that shape present-day life. Elders and leaders argue for recognition of treaty rights and for partnerships that respect tribal sovereignty. Youth activists use social media and legal channels to press for accountability and for investment in their communities. The through line connecting those efforts to the era of Geronimo is clear. The past informs strategy, and memory fuels demand for justice. Listening to these layers of legacy, one senses that the story is not a closed chapter. It is a living narrative that continues to influence law, culture, and communal identity. The Apache Wars and the figure of Geronimo are no longer simply episodes in a distant chronicle. They are touchstones for ongoing debates about power, dignity, and historical responsibility. As you reflect on this, consider how public memory shapes policy, and how communities turn trauma into strength. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, a subscription helps bring more of these nuanced histories to light. Hello, thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. We close on a landscape that still remembers Geronimo, the high desert ridges, the narrow canyons, the long trails that carried families and fighters alike. His life was not a simple legend of hero or villain, but a complex human story shaped by loss, resistance, and endurance. To leave you with a clear sense of what matters most from this history, here are the key points in plain terms. First, Geronimo and the Apache resistance sprang from a struggle over home and survival. As settlers, soldiers, and new laws pushed into the Southwest in the 19th century, Apache communities faced displacement and pressure to change their ways. The clash was as much about competing visions of land and life as it was about isolated encounters on the frontier. Second, the term reservation refers to land that a government set aside for native peoples. Reservations were meant to confine and regulate communities, often breaking patterns of traditional life and independence. This policy reshaped the Apache world, limiting movements that had been essential for seasonal hunting, gathering, and social ties. Third, Geronimo became a symbol, not simply because of his actions in the field, but because his persistence exposed the limits of military power and the human cost of forced assimilation. His final surrender in 1886 did not erase the questions his resistance raised about justice, treaty promises, and cultural survival. Fourth, the aftermath matters as much as the conflict itself. Many Apache women, men, and children endured long relocations, challenging conditions on distant lands, and the slow process of adapting to imposed systems. Yet within that hardship, cultural knowledge, language, and identity continued to be passed down. Resilience took many forms: storytelling, ceremonies, kinship networks, and quiet acts of survival. As you reflect, you might find parts of this story familiar in other times and places. Communities pushed to the margins, ideals of nation and progress colliding with older ways of life, and individuals caught between choices no one should have to make. If this narrative touched you, whether it sparked curiosity, discomfort, or a new question, first invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what surprised you, what you want to know more about, or whose story you would like us to explore next. If you enjoyed this journey and want to keep exploring these quieter corners of history, please subscribe. Subscribing helps us keep making thoughtful, well-researched stories like this one. You can also like and share if you found value here. It helps others discover these perspectives too. In future episodes, we will continue to look beyond single names and simple headlines. We will trace the lives of other leaders and families from the Southwest and beyond, examine the policies that shape their destinies, and listen to voices that have too often been left out of the picture. Expect deep dives into related stories, from Apache leaders like Cochise to the broader effects of federal Indian policy across the continent, told with the same care and calm attention we gave here. Thank you for coming along on this chapter of the story. As the sun falls across those same ridges Geronimo once knew, we leave with a quieter understanding that history is not only a record of battles and treaties, but a continuing conversation about memory, place, and dignity. Until next time, take care, and keep asking the questions that help us see the past more clearly.